Okay, so Murray Amateur Radio Club, we're gonna talk tonight about event roles and responsibilities. So this is for people who are interested in participating in events and want to know how they work and what they're about. Let's go ahead and get started. So first, let's talk about events. What are we talking about when we talk about an event? In general, I'm talking about any kind of event where amateur radio is being used to support some not necessarily radio related activities. So I'm not talking about field day, but I'm talking about things like, oh, there's a bike race and they want amateur radio operators to help with communications. Oh, there's a parade. Murray City has their parade every year. They want radio operators to be able to help out with that. Search and rescue events where someone is lost on the side of a mountain and they need to be able to be, communicate effectively in areas where maybe public service radios don't reach and cell phone coverage is spotty, or an emergency situation such as a CERT activation or some kind of remote accident or something like that. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about these. So what do events have to do with amateur radio? So in our role as amateur radio operators, the amateur radio service was created and is supported by the FCC because of services that we can provide. Now, some of that includes things like learning about radios and radio things and how to put electronic circuits together to do stuff and stuff like that, which is considered to be valuable by the FCC because that is a utilization of scientific principles that is helpful to our country. But they also expect that we will use our expertise and our equipment to help in situations where communications is required and may not be available via traditional means. So no cellular service. So you're stuck up in a canyon or out in the middle of the desert or something like that. No cell service is active. I know, like, if you stay on the freeways, you pretty much have cell service everywhere. But if you go out in the desert, like say you're following the Pony Express Trail or something like that, it doesn't take very long before you cannot get a cell signal to save your life. However, amateur radio still works. Maybe the public radio service is not available. For example, if there was a large earthquake here, most likely the UCAN system would be flooded with other traffic, and the people trying to utilize it may have problems or difficulties actually getting their signal out. So UCAN is the Utah Communications Access Network. It's basically the public service network that's used by most of the communities in most of Utah. They maintain repeaters, and it's a trunk system. So I forget, they have like 15 different frequencies that are in use on that system, and that essentially means that 15 people can talk at a time. But when you're working on a trunk system like that, the way it works is there's like a master frequency that is a control frequency, and all the radios are connected to that. It's like a digital setup. When you have your radio and you key up to talk on a particular talk group, a signal gets sent from your radio to the controller, and the controller identifies a frequency and time slot for you to get on and sends that back to your radio. And then your radio says, okay, it's all right for you to transmit now. Until it says that, you could talk at the mic all day and your signal isn't going anywhere. In most normal cases, you key up, and before you even have a chance to move the mic to your mouth, you've got the signal, you've got a repeater pair. But if it's really busy, you may key up and have to wait a few seconds to get your slot. And typically those radios will beep or something, some way to tell you that, yes, it's okay to transmit. And then, of course, as soon as you unkey, that frequency can be used by the system for a different conversation or a different talk group. So there are hundreds of talk groups on UCAN that are actively using that system all the time. If there was a large scale event like an earthquake, you can imagine every agency around here is going to be trying to use that radio system, and they could very easily overwhelm it. The other thing that amateur radio can be used for is getting messages out. So if you've got an event happening in an area, this happens like Hurricane Katrina was a good example. Katrina took out all of the infrastructure. So all the cell phones were down, all the landline phone systems were down, everything was down. But people stuck in there needed to be able to get messages out to their family who lived farther away to let them know that they were okay, or that they weren't okay and they were on their way to come see them or whatever, right? So amateur radio operators stepped in to pass messages for that purpose, to be able to get that, they call it health and welfare type traffic outside of the affected area.
So did they use like digital stuff to do that, or was it?
A lot of HF, a lot of HF stuff was going on there. So, so when we talk about events, there's a couple of different types of event, right? You've got formal events and you've got essentially ad hoc events or events that are spontaneous. So a formal event is typically going to have a communications plan. It's going to have a defined purpose. People are going to have assigned roles. In an ad hoc event, something happened and you happen to be there and you happen to have your radio. Suddenly you're called upon to communicate on behalf of the people who are affected. So we'll talk about the two differences. I got some examples of some ad hoc events. I'm actually gonna do some reading here, so bear with me. And I've got links to these stories as well. So if you want to refer to them later, you can. But in this particular one, this was in Wisconsin. Amateur radio operator Scott Strecker, KG9IV. He says, it was Friday, September 2nd, 2022, which meant I worked from my home office. I have the VHF radio on low to monitor it in the background. Recently, I got into the All-Star node with a hotspot. I use it to monitor the FM 38 system, which is All-Star 2495 in the southern part of Wisconsin. About 7:45 a.m., I heard the All-Star node come up. An individual in distress was asking for assistance to get an ambulance to him. It was a ham in Brown Deer, Wisconsin. He'd slipped on his bathroom floor and went down so hard he could not get up, but he happened to have his handheld with him. Don't we all, it says. He did not have access to the phone and he lived alone. Took his radio to the bathroom, but he didn't take his phone. I called the Brown Deer Police call center. The dispatcher got the fire department rolling and then started asking me for more details. I had the dispatcher on speakerphone and he could hear the ham's responses to the questions. Being on a handheld and lying prone, the signal was at times noisy. At that time, both the other ham and I used ITU phonetics to get the exact info out. All those times practicing on the Aries nets made it second nature. The dispatcher was also able to understand the info without my having to repeat it. So that was an ad hoc event. The guy just happened to be monitoring the radio and heard this guy have a problem. And he jumped in and responded and called emergency services. Just a typical use of amateur radio for that. Here's another one. This was in Idaho, a little more close to home. Shannon Vore, KK7GBG, and CJ Bouchard, KK7GNG. On September 3rd, 2022, in the Rocky Mountains in northwest Idaho, they were out for a weekend of four-wheeling in their Jeep. About 4:30 p.m., Vore and Bouchard were taking a break when an approaching truck notified them of an ATV accident involving two teenage girls. The accident scene was just a few miles away, and when they arrived, it was clear the teenagers were critically injured. Bouchard was unable to contact several local repeaters, but was finally able to make contact using a simplex frequency, 146.420, that's popular with the hams in Coeur d'Alene, 20 miles from the accident site. While Bouchard and an off-duty EMT were administering medical aid to the teenagers, Vore took over radio operations. The call for emergency assistance was picked up by local amateur radio operator John Tapero, K7JNT, who immediately called 911 and asked that 146.420 be used only for emergency traffic. For nearly 2 hours, Vore and Tapero provided relay between the 911 dispatcher, advising the condition of the injured and the approaching weather. Life Flight Network was unable to respond because of a severe thunderstorm immediately over the rescue site. 2 teams of EMTs were dispatched, but due to the mountains and the storm, they couldn't communicate with dispatch. Tapero continued to provide relay information for all parties until 6 p.m. when the EMTs arrived. The teenagers were in stable condition and immediately transported to the nearest hospital. Today, they're in good condition and recovering. So there's a case where they just happened to be in the area, had their radios, and were able to make contact with someone who had telephone access and could call 911. And then this one, this is the last one. Brent Yates, KA7FAP in Logan Canyon. When a semi-truck and trailer rolled and crashed in Logan Canyon Wednesday morning, a passing motorist stopped to help when the rig's wheels were still spinning and managed to notify emergency dispatchers in an area of national forest where cell phone reception is non-existent. But Brent Yates of North Logan wasn't using a cell phone. He was using a handheld amateur radio to report the incident after the semi-trailer filled with 38,000 pounds of dairy products landed in the Logan River. Another radio operator, Brent L. Caruth of Logan, heard Yates make the call just before noon Wednesday. Caruth said he listened to Yates give a firsthand account of the condition of the driver and the seriousness of the crash. Utah Highway Patrol officials originally reported that the call for help came from a motorist who traveled to a cell phone reception area before calling 911. Caruth, however, explained how Yates's small transceiver was used to call 911 right from the scene of the crash. The repeater on Logan Peak, which is owned by the Bridgerland Amateur Radio Club, can pick up transmissions from all over the region and has an added feature built in that allows radio operators to dial a phone number on their transceiver to call local telephone lines. So he used the auto patch on the repeater system, was able to get into 911 and get emergency services contacted. So that's kind of cool. This was I don't remember when that was. I remember hearing about that when it happened, but I don't remember exactly when that was. All right, so let's talk about some formal events. So those are some ad hoc events. Let's talk about some formal event examples. So one example is a Bike MS annual bike race in Cache County. There's a 100-mile and a 50-mile ride. Typically, they do the 100-mile ride on Saturday and the 50-mile ride on Sunday. What I'm showing here, there's 3 separate ones you can do. You can do like a 50, 100-kilometer, and 100-mile typically, but most people will pick one of those 3 and do them, but they run on the same course. But basically, what I've shown here in the slide is you can see the part of the event action plan, or the event plan that we use to keep track of what's going on. You can see, we'll talk more about these forms a little bit later, but there's like a cover page and then a page that displays the objectives, and then kind of a list of stations that are going to be involved in it. We'll talk about that in more detail a little bit later, but this is just one example, is this Bike MS ride. Another example would be our Murray Fun Days Parade. We provide updates to the people running the loudspeakers along the parade route that are telling the public what float is coming up. Sometimes they have a last minute removal of a float, or the order gets changed or something, and that information is communicated out using amateur radio. What I've shown here is the parade route map with the various locations, and then our communications plan, which shows who's manning each particular station that particular year. So that was actually a couple of years ago. And then another example would be El Dorado Search and Rescue Group. These guys use APRS to track their rescue teams. APRS, you remember we talked about, is the automatic packet reporting system, and it allows the transmission of digital data, including position data. And they use some software called StarTrack to keep track of that and be able to know where their individual groups are at any given time. They also, when they can't reach the public service radio system, they will use amateur radio to communicate. Another example right here locally is the TERT team, the Timpanogos Emergency Response Team, down on the south side of Mount Timpanogos in the canyon down there. They have a team that is there usually all weekend long, and quite often during the week as well in the summertime, that have people available to help rescue climbers and hikers who get stuck on the mountain. They use amateur radio to communicate between the teams and between the teams and public service providers. For example, they have actually been able to vector in life flight to recover people who are stuck on the side of the mountain. So there's a link to their website there, turt.org, if you're interested in that. I know Dan has had the training. They have a big training program that they go through. I know he's been through that and has done that as well. So if he was here tonight, I'd pick his brain a little bit, but sadly, he's not with us tonight. And another formal event example is the Low to Jaw bike race. It's over 200 miles. I think the shortest route is like 206 miles and the longest is like 209 or something like that, between Logan, Utah and Jackson, Wyoming. It's typically a 4-day event. There are multiple routes involved. Riders often have support teams with them, which is like a vehicle that's carrying extra gear for them or following along. They typically don't let the support teams drive on the same roads as the bikers are riding on, just to keep that a little separated so they don't have to worry about people running over bikes. But they have amateur radio operators on the course and at the various way stations, and they use APRS pretty heavily for that race. And I was reading about it. One of the comments made was that vehicles have to have a dual band mobile radio. A handheld won't cut it, they said, because in some of the areas that they operate, they are quite a long ways away from the nearest repeaters. But they use multiple repeaters and simplex frequencies along the course. This is an example from their 2020 communications plan. And so you can see they start at Logan in Utah, and there's one particular repeater that they use for that. And then each leg, they're using a different set of frequencies or different group of repeaters to communicate, all the way up as they get all the way up into Jackson.
Would the intertech system, they can separate solar and split it into sections? Would they do that the first section here?
Typically, they don't use the intertype frequencies. They use more local frequencies, but they do that. Some of the repeaters up there in Logan are on a linked system. And I know, like when we use it for Bike MS, and I'm sure for Low to Jaw as well, they unlink those repeaters so that people can continue to communicate on the non-race dedicated system, while the racers or the race staff are allowed to utilize that frequency without interference from people not involved in the event, basically. I don't think the intertie is used for any of that, though. I know the intertie has a station around Bear Lake area, but that's the only one that's in that area that I know of that would be accessible in that case. I'm pretty sure they do not use that for Low to Jaw. What you can see here is you can see kind of the visual overview map, and then there's also a page showing the full communications plan where it lists all of the different frequencies and everything that are used. This stuff is all published. It's online if you want to go check it out. Okay, so now we've talked about some of the different roles and some of the things that are out there, how we would use them, why we would use them. Let's talk about some of the specific things that are going to be used in a given event. So let's talk first about a bike or foot race. Common positions that are used would be the net control, aid station, SAG. SAG stands for supplies and gear. Shuttle, which is for transportation, staff shadow, ride marshals, and potentially motorcycle mobile. We'll talk about each of those. So net control, typically a team of operators, 2 or 3, sometimes more, are used to run the net control. They're responsible for managing the net and managing all the communications that are going on during the event, right? So they're responsible for making sure that messages are being passed effectively, that stations are responding when they're called, that messages get passed to whoever they need to get to. They track and direct any of the vehicles that are involved and personnel. and they monitor the position of various resources and status, and they liaise with any local law enforcement or emergency services that might be required.
You got 2 or 3 operators, isn't it control and they monitor different frequencies?
Sometimes they're monitoring different frequencies. Sometimes one is monitoring the radio frequency and the other one is responsible for logging information or for, communicating either outside of the normal net or in other cases where they may have other responsibilities. Sometimes some events use multiple frequencies, like with low to jaw, there's 5 or 6 different frequencies that are in use. And so you need to be able to manage that and have sufficient staff to cover all of those, right? So
Also, question that one, I'm assuming they would switch every once in a while. So you don't get.
yeah, so you don't get burned out, right? Yeah, I'm sure they rotate responsibilities. I know when we do the bike MS, we typically have 3 operators on net control, and they'll switch it out as far as who's actually on the radio and who's not. So
I'm assuming they will kind of get in.
going to get in a what?
They kind of get out. There's always kind of.
Oh, so they know when they have had enough is what you're thinking? Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure they do. I've never worked net control for an event like that, but I have on the bike. I do the bike MS every year. It's always the same weekend as field day. So I never do field day. I always do the bike MS. They always have trouble finding operators because for some reason people want to do field day instead. But some of us enjoy going up and doing the bike race. So
I thought about doing that by stopping grounds.
up in Logan. Yeah. They call it the best dam bike race in Utah because it goes around all these different dams that are in that area up there. And if you ever go up in Cache Valley, get out of town. Don't just stay in Logan. Go around in some of the surrounding areas and drive around. You'll see some pretty cool stuff. So
I've actually run one.
have you ridden in the race?
And it's back in all 3.
Yeah.
And they told me about there's going the county went up to Outer Ranch.
Oh yeah.
It's easier to go up the hill.
Because of the wind. Yeah. 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 That's on Sunday for that race. Typically on Bike MS, the Saturday is north of Logan and they go up into Idaho and back. And then the Sunday they go south and then up the mountain, up the hill towards Hardware Ranch and then back down. And yeah, I've heard it said that when you're riding up, the wind is typically at your back because it's blowing up the canyon and it's a lot easier to go up. And then when you turn around, you're head into the wind, even though you're going downhill, the wind is in your face. So it can be a little more uncomfortable.
2 days were switched. And we actually talked to one of, I don't know, it was a trooper or a sheriff. And he said he was coming down that canyon. And some of the bikers were using it as a.
That's a shield. I can see that happening. So it basically net control, they're responsible for keeping track of what's going on the net and making sure that things are working smoothly. Aid station rest area operators, these people are out there to provide communications for the aid station staff, right? They will often track runners or riders as they pass through the station. Typically, they'll want to know at least when the first rider or first runner has come through, and they'll want to know when the last one is going through so they know when to close down the aid station. Some races actually track all the participants. I know what's the one, the Salt Flats Endurance Race? That's one where they track all of the participants because they don't want to lose anybody out on the Salt Flats. So if someone doesn't make it into an aid station, they want to know about that so they can go find them. So that's kind of interesting. They're also responsible for things like if the aid station is getting low on supplies. For example, one year I remember we had a lot of riders who really wanted pickle juice, which I never knew that pickle juice was a thing that people drank, but apparently it is. Apparently it restores some of the electrolytes in your system very quickly. And so we were running low on pickle juice, and we ended up calling in to net control to arrange for an extra delivery of pickle juice to our aid station so that we had enough for all the riders as they came through. But that's just one example, right? They'll also communicate with SAG and shuttle drivers as they pass through the station. So typically, we'll talk more about SAG and shuttle in a second, but typically as they come through a station, they'll stop and say, hey, I'm SAG, whatever, just coming through. Did you guys need anything? How's everything going? That kind of thing, just to check in and make sure that people know that they're around, right? The aid station operator can coordinate with law enforcement, emergency service personnel as needed. They'll usually route that through net control, but in a situation where something is urgent, they are certainly able to contact them directly. We had, last time I did Bike MS, we had a couple of highway patrol motorcycles stop and visit with us at the aid station as they were running about their rounds. And they came in and checked in with us there. So last thing that they typically will do is provide direction to participants. I know that I've been asked a lot of times what direction they should head out of the aid station, or what the next aid station is, how far away it is, things like that. So as a radio operator, you've got a copy of the route map and the plan for the race. So you can pull that up and show them, look, this is where we are, this is where you're going next, and so on. SAG vehicles and drivers. So SAG, the supplies and gear guys, these guys patrol the course. They will typically drive up and down the course across the various legs, and they ensure things like the route markers are present and accurate. We have had problems in the past with that, where somebody for fun has changed the direction of a route marker to point in a different direction, or removed a marker. Or in one case, we had some markers that were leading into the aid station, and right above, so we had them on a sign. There was an arrow pointing to the left, and right above that was a giant arrow pointing straight ahead for a big yard sale that was happening. And some people ended up blowing right through that, missing our arrow and following the big one until they found themselves at the yard sale or heading up the wrong road into the canyon. So what we ended up doing was parking a SAG vehicle there at that location to tell them go that way, right? So that's something that can be very helpful, to have a SAG vehicle that can actually deploy out there, be on the course with the riders, and be able to help them out. They also will help riders or runners with basic tools or first aid. Typically, they'll carry things like a bicycle pump, or sometimes spare inner tubes or something like that. So if a rider gets a flat tire or something, they can recover from that and get them back on their way. They may carry things like water, stuff like that. So if someone is having a hypothermic event while they're running, they can either pick them up right there, give them water, or something like that. They'll transport riders and runners to the nearest aid station when needed. We had one rider, I remember, who she had MS, and she had ridden 75 miles and didn't think she could make it the rest of the way. And so one of the SAG drivers picked her up and took her the rest of the way back to the finish line. So they'll transport DNF. DNF stands for did not finish. So not everybody finishes the race. They'll transport them back to the start finish areas or to the nearest aid station. And they can typically transport 1 or 2 passengers plus their equipment. So if it's a bike race, they'll typically have a bike rack on the back of their vehicle where they can carry at least a couple of bikes and put a couple of people in the car with them. Shuttle drivers are also used to transport people. That typically they don't go out on the course itself. They'll go outside of the course boundaries, and typically they will only pick people up or drop them off at aid stations or the start finish area. The reason for that is you don't want to have too many vehicles out on the course unnecessarily, right? So typically shuttles are larger vehicles, maybe a van or a big pickup truck or something like that. Typically they can carry more passengers and more bikes than your typical SAG vehicle. I've seen SAG drivers driving Priuses before, so it's not something that you have to have a big investment in equipment to be able to do that and provide those services. Sometimes they are used also to transport things like at one race I did, they started early in the morning, and so a lot of the riders had jackets. But once they got to that first aid station, they didn't want their jackets anymore because the day was starting to warm up and they were warming up physically. And so they had drop bags that they could put their stuff in and put a bib number on it and then leave it there at the aid station. Shuttle driver come by, load them up and take them back to the finish line. That way they could pick up their stuff. So they didn't have to worry about carrying excess weight all the way through the race. In some races like low to jaw, where the start is far away from the finish, they typically don't use the shuttle drivers to transport people back to the beginning or back to wherever their cars are. They will typically have made other arrangements. They'll have a bus or something like that that they will use to transport people back. But I've seen shuttles carry like people who came in late that missed the normal transport. I've seen shuttles transport them in that case. Staff shadow is another position that you may find yourself asked to do in an event. They will typically walk around with their handheld with somebody on the race staff, like the race director or some kind of support personnel or something. And that way they can provide instant communication to that person as needed. So if something happens on the course, rather than trying to find the person's phone number and call them and hope that they didn't leave their phone in the car or something like that, Net Control can reach out to the operator who's acting as a staff shadow and pass a message directly to that person. A lot of times the staff shadows will also monitor the rest of the network traffic. Sometimes they're on a different frequency, in which case they're not doing that, and it's up to Net Control to pass those messages. But occasionally they will be able to monitor that and be able to advise their staff member of things before they would otherwise know about them. And then ride marshals.
Question with the medical.
Yeah.
Would, I'm assuming medical, sometimes if they have an ambulance, they'll have their radio system and they'll have an amateur radio person with them, so they can do that.
Typically not. They typically don't. The public service EMTs and stuff do not. This would be like a race staff member who was responsible for medical services. For example, they might have a nurse on staff that is available for whatever reason. They may have a physical therapist or something like that on staff, but it typically, if it's a public service, like an ambulance or something like that, they would be on their own system and we would work with them through their dispatcher without having to go through the the radio system. So ride marshals are riders or runners who are actually in the race with other racers. So they are actually out there on their bikes, right? Or out there running with the group. They can do things like monitor participant behavior, make sure nobody's doing something dumb. They're the person on the course, and they'll typically wear some kind of jersey or marking that indicates that they're the ride marshal. In some events, I've seen ride marshals carrying APRS trackers. Obviously, we're not going to give a tracker to every participant in the race, but if you've got ride marshals that have a tracker, and you can see them on the map and know where people are, where those larger groups are and things like that. So very critical role that ride marshals will play. You've done ride marshal before? Yeah, so basically you're out there with the other riders as though you're one of them.
I couldn't keep up with it.
Yeah.
I was on a mountain bike, they were,
They were not on a mountain bike, I said.
no, definitely not.
And then motorcycle mobile. I know both Dan and Ragnar have done motorcycle mobile. Typically, these are operators who are actually on a motorcycle out in the middle of the course. you'll typically have a lead operator who's out in front of the first rider. And they're going to go through ahead of that rider and make sure that the course is well marked and correct. They're going to be checking for things like hazards. We had one instance where there was a snake in the road, and the motorcycle operator who was running out ahead of the group saw this and was able to essentially run interference for that snake and keep it from getting ridden over by a bunch of bikes. But that was a case where having that operator out there was helpful. We were able to communicate that back and make sure that people knew that that was coming up. There'll also be a motorcycle following the last rider, or in some cases riding along with the last rider. I know Ragnar has done that before. When we did the 5 Canyons race a couple of years ago, there was one rider who was quite a ways behind the rest of the group, and Ragnar stuck with her all the way through to the finish. So their goal is making sure nobody gets left behind, make sure that there's nobody left on the course at the end of the event. Sometimes you'll have embedded motorcycle operators who are running within the grouping and running back and forth and making sure it's kind of like a SAG driver, but they're not providing SAG assistance. Basically, they're just out there observing and making sure that things are there. Let's talk about a search and rescue event. So in a search and rescue event, you're going to have embedded communicators. There are people who travel with the various teams, right? You're going to have people who are trained to work with the public service personnel. They may be working with park rangers. They may be working with law enforcement, EMS, life flight services. For example, on the TERT team, the Timpanogos team, they are actually trained to operate the public service radios and can actually get out there and marshal in the helicopter when it comes into land and be able to help them come in and land safely. So that's a case where here's a person who is not necessarily a EMS personnel, but they're tasked with that because of their experience working on radios. You will typically find that in a search and rescue type event, you may find that auto patches are used. I know with TERT, they actually can take inbound calls from dispatch on the auto patch. So you'll be sitting there monitoring the radio and you'll hear the phone ring and it's ringing on the radio. And there's an inbound call coming in on the auto patch, and they have to be able to take that and route that message that comes in on that system. They'll typically be responsible for relaying messages. In some cases, for example, maybe you're at one end of a canyon and your signal can't reach the other end of the canyon, but you can reach an operator that's halfway down the canyon. And that way you can relay that messages back and forth along the entire area. Quite often they'll use portable repeaters or digipeaters. We haven't really talked about digipeaters. Digipeater is a digital repeater, basically. It will receive digital communications like packet radio or APRS and retransmit it. So it kind of acts like a repeater, but for digital use. And then, of course, people will be using APRS trackers and two-way APRS systems. All right, let's talk about some typical equipment you may have while you're participating in an event. Let's see. We do it time-wise. Oh, we're good. So typically, you're going to have some radios, right? You want to have most likely a 2-meter or dual band radio. The frequencies typically used, we typically use 2-meter radios for events. We do that because nearly everybody has a 2-meter radio, right? So 2-meter is very prevalent. There are 2-meter repeaters all over the place. So it's usually possible to get a good signal out with a 2-meter system. Sometimes you'll find other frequencies being used. I've seen 6-meter used on an event. I've seen 10 meters used on an event as well. So it kind of depends on where the event is and what the terrain is and things like that. Mobile radios are often recommended because they've got more power, better antennas, Some people will build elaborate Go kits. I know we've talked about Go kits in here before. I've got a link here to our Go kits class that we did, or presentation that was done. You may use crossband repeat. We've talked about crossband repeat before. Just to make sure everybody knows what that is. That's basically when you've got a radio that's set up so that anything it receives on, for example, the 70 centimeter band, it retransmits on the 2-meter band, hence cross band, right? You're coming in on one band and going out on another. You may use that in a case where you need to be out away from your vehicle for whatever you're doing, like staff shadow, for example, but you need the power of your vehicle's radio to be able to reach whatever repeater you're using for the event. So you'll configure your vehicle radio to work in crossband repeat mode, and you'll carry your handheld so that you can actually get your transmission out through that extra hop. People typically carry extra batteries, extra antennas, even an extra radio. Last time when I was doing Bike MS, I had failed to charge my radio the night before, and it died about an hour before the end of the event. But fortunately, I had a second radio with me, and I was able to turn that on and get in and continue to act as an aid station operator. If I hadn't had that second radio, I'd have been running back and forth to my car all the time, which would not have been great for what we were doing. Another thing that you'll find used in a lot of events is APRS, and we've talked about APRS before a couple of times. I've got a link here to our initial introduction to APRS, but in general, when you think about APRS, there's two different ways it can be set up. You can have what are called one-way trackers or full two-way stations. Trackers, basically all they do is transmit your position report. So they do that periodically. Every 10 minutes, they'll send out a packet saying, I'm at this location. They're connected to a GPS, so they know where you are, and it'll just send a message out. But there's no way to receive information through that. Those are typically used by certain roles like ride marshals. When you're riding on the bike, you may not have time to concentrate on your radio to make calls. Your tracker operates independently. It's automatic, remember, so it automatically sends out those reports. Two-way stations allow you to not only monitor where things are because you can receive those incoming packets, but also allows you to send messages using APRS and things like that. So two-way systems are preferred, and two-way systems will be used by, for example, SAG operators, net control, things like that. All right, let's talk about the communications plan. So when you're setting up a communications plan for an event, there's a few things that you need to consider. And amazingly, people have already considered this and produced a set of forms that are ideal for exactly this purpose. These are the ICS forms. And we haven't done a good presentation on ICS forms yet. I think that's on our list to do at some point, but we haven't done that yet. I did link here to the Rat Pack presentation. I have not watched that presentation. I don't know if it's good or not, but if you're interested, you can check it out. There's a few different forms that are commonly used. The 202 form is the objectives form. 203 is the assignment list. We're going to talk about each of these in a minute. 205 is the radio communications plan. 205A is the communications list. And then the 214 form is the unit activity log. And another form that may be used sometimes would be the simple ARRL radiogram form. And we'll talk about that in a minute too. Okay. So form 202, the objectives. This form includes things like the incident name, the operational period, which is when does the event start and when does it end, the objectives of the event, not necessarily the objectives of the communications, but the objectives of the whole event, a general overview and description of the event, and information about what other forms are needed or are in use for this particular event. The form 203, the assignment list, describes all of the participants in the event. So participants being like the incident commander or event principal, race director, whatever you want to call them. These are not just radio operator positions. Again, these are all important participants in the event. Also information about the communications personnel, net control, aid station operators, SAG drivers, etc., and any other important personnel that are part of the event. And typically this list will also include tactical call signs. I put a link here to our presentation on tactical call signs, so people can review that if they need to. But essentially, tactical call signs are used in events to remove the or to aid with clarity about who's talking to who, right? So if I'm out participating in an event and I'm at a particular aid station and I need to speak to a specific SAG operator, rather than calling that operator by their call sign, I'm going to call them by their tactical call sign, which may be something like SAG 2 or SAG 3. The reason for that is somebody may be reassigned and it may be a different operator than I originally thought who's SAG 2 or SAG 3. And I don't really need to talk to that specific operator. I need to talk to that unit, that vehicle or whatever. So tactical call signs help you to operate more effectively in that regard, as far as making sure that the different resources are able to communicate effectively. The Form 205, excuse me, is the radio communications plan. That's basically a list of communications resources or systems that are in use during the event. That may include things like the repeaters that are in use, including their frequencies, tones, anything that you need to program your radio to utilize that repeater is going to be in this plan. Any simplex frequencies that are in use, any APRS information that's in use. For example, some events will use a non-standard APRS frequency because APRS has a limited amount of bandwidth, and you don't want to tie that up with race traffic, and you also don't want race traffic to be encumbered by non-race traffic as well. So they may use a non-standard frequency, in which case that would be listed in this radio communications plan.
Don't they use coincidence so much of that, but we use the microwave to pass the data on when you get to a certain station.
It depends on the event, right? I mean, some events do utilize things like direct point-to-point microwave links, like Airden setups or something like that. They'll use that for high-speed data communications. You know, it really depends on the event as far as how that's being used. Something else that you can do with APRS is you can use an APRS digipeater where it's actually operating on a split frequency. So one frequency is being used for receiving the information and then another for sending it back out. So rather than a digipeater that's receiving and transmitting on the same frequency, it's receiving and transmitting on different frequencies like a regular repeater. So you have all of your trackers, for example, on one frequency where they're not interfering with other stations, and they're all feeding into a digipeater that is sending out into the normal frequency. We should probably do a class on how that works and how different APRS settings are done. I'll put that on the list for something to do. Also, if there's any public service communication systems in use, those are detailed in the communications plan. For example, if there's a particular talk group on the public service network that's being used, that would be included in there. Also, any phone numbers for emergency services, dispatch, things like that would be included in this plan. So basically, any communications that you're going to be doing, you can refer to this form for the information that you need. And finally, the 205A, the communications list, records methods of contact for various personnel. So typically it'll have a list of people and alternate communications mechanisms to reach them. Maybe their phone number, pager, cell phone, email, different mechanisms to be able to reach them. And it will also include any assigned vehicles, tactical call signs for those as well. So things like hazmat or motorcycle or SAG operator and a specific identifier. And then The 214 is the unit activity log, and this is the one that gets the most use during the event itself. So each station is going to maintain a log of their communication events, right? And the logs include time and date of the communications, the stations that were involved, and any messages that were passed. You typically don't log every radio communication that you make, only ones that are notable or may be important to know about. So for example, if a SAG driver calls in to ask if you need lunch brought to you, that you probably don't need to write down. But if a SAG driver calls in and says, I found a rider in the ditch and I'm bringing them to the aid station, have emergency services meet us there, that's one that you want to log and write down, right? So just to get kind of an idea there. You'll have one of these forms for each station, and after the event, those various operators should give copies of those forms back to the communications coordinator for the event, so that it can all be kept together as a summary of what happened during the event. A lot of times that doesn't happen, but it should happen. And then
This thing you can do for. So, not the right for. Come back to the communications law.
we could do that. We should do that. Maybe we'll do that when we set up for the parade this year. Let's keep that in mind. When we do the parade this year, let's do a full communications plan, as if we were doing a full scale large event. Let's keep that as an option, and we'll try to do that this year. We'll try to plan a little bit more ahead this year, since we have a pretty good idea when it's going to be. So, and then I included a copy of the ARRL radiogram here. Basically, what this is when you're passing formal traffic, it's just a form to help you keep track of all the information that you're needing in order to do that, so that you don't forget anything. So you can see the way this is set up. It's got the message number, precedence, station of origin, place of origin, where it's being sent to, who received it, and then the message itself. And you can see it has like, what is there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 25 words you can have for the message. And then a place to log that it was received or sent. So this is just a standard form that the ARRL has put together. There are other forms that can be used for this type of thing as well, but I found a copy of this, so included this in the presentation. It's similar to the 213. Yeah, I didn't have a copy of the 213 for some reason. Okay, so how do I get involved in events? How do I participate in these things? Check out Utah SAG. I put a list on here of some upcoming events. This is events for the first half of the year. The next one will be the Moab Skinny Tire Festival in March. And then there will be the East Canyon Road Race and Public Ride in April. The Little Wild Horse, also on April 15th. Salt Lake City Marathon Bike Tour. In May, we've got the Salt Flats Endurance Run, the Front Runner Century, the Provo City Half Marathon, and Ride with the Angels. If you're interested, check out utahsag.org. You can sign up there and get on the list, and you'll get emails from Mickey about this. Mickey, yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Interesting thing, April 22nd is Earth Day.
Earth Day.
Yeah.
So there may be other events planned for that day as well. I don't know. I'm sure there will be. A lot of times you'll see multiple events on the same day because there are only so many Saturdays in the summer. So when that happens, sometimes there's a lot of interest in signing up for one and not so much signing up for the other ones. So it's a good idea to get your name out there and say, hey, you know, if you need operators, give me a call and I can help out with that or whatever. You can see on this list, there's 2 on April 15th, plus the Salt Flats Endurance Run, which starts on Friday the 5th and goes till 6 p.m. on Saturday. That crosses over with the front runner Century, which is also on the 6th. Mickey will be teaching a class on March 16th for us. He'll be, I don't know if he'll do that in person or if he'll do it via Zoom. I tried to get him for February for next week, but he had surgery and is not able to get out quite yet. So he will be available for us on March 16th and will talk to us about Utah SAG. But I definitely recommend checking out the website, joining up, getting your name on the list, looking through their stuff for any events that look like fun, and getting involved. Get yourself out there and start participating in events. It's a lot of fun. And it gives you a chance to use your radio and use your amateur radio operator abilities and license to help some people out. And that's all that I have. So any questions or comments or other things? Yeah.
Pardon me, what is the portable repeater used for in these kinds of?
So sometimes, I know UARC has a repeater mounted on a trailer that they can take out to somewhere that doesn't have good repeater coverage. For example, if you were doing something out in the West Desert, you may be in a place where you don't have good repeater coverage, but they can put this portable repeater out there, and it's on a trailer, it's got a generator, and so it's fully self-contained, and you can put that up and access it just like any other repeater. It's got a big antenna on a tall mast that they can crank up and get it out there, and that way, I don't know. I'd have to go look at it, but probably 30 feet, something like that.
Seems like the county areas, I think the county areas used to have one. But I don't know if we still have one.
I don't know. I know like Davis County Fire Department has their incident vehicle, and they have amateur radios mounted on that as well. And so they can operate that as a communication station out remotely. So so there's a few different options there, but basically it's a repeater. Think of it like a repeater that you can take somewhere and set up in an area where there isn't one already. And then when you're done using it, you can take it back down and move it wherever you want, right? So
I'm guessing, I suppose there's inexpensive ones and really expensive. Depending what they do.
it doesn't take much to have a repeater. All you need is basically 2 radios and an appropriate antenna. And especially for a portable repeater where you're going to potentially have an operator monitoring it continuously, you don't necessarily need a repeater controller or anything like that. You can just have 2 radios connected together so that what one radio receives, it transmits on the other radio, right? And if you're out in the middle of nowhere, you're typically not dealing with a lot of interference from other radio transmissions around you. So you don't need the big cavities and things like that necessarily. So, that's something to consider. If we
seen one for GMRS that's box that you can antenna to and power supply to. There you go.
Yeah, so you remember, this was probably a month or 2 ago, the Forest Service was moaning about finding these setups up out in the middle of nowhere where there was a repeater solar panel in a little box, and they didn't know what they were for, so they were removing them. And there was some discussion among amateur radio operators that they were probably GMRS repeaters that people had put out there so that when they were out in that area, they could communicate via repeater. So I never heard any outcome from that, like what was actually in the box. I never heard any results on that, but it was an interesting thing that it made the news that they were finding these things and picking them up, but then the news just kind of dropped it because apparently it wasn't interesting enough for Joe Public. So I'm curious what they actually found out that they were and what was actually in the box, but yeah, so it doesn't take much to make a repeater. Like you say, for you know, a box with some batteries, a solar panel and an antenna and a couple of radios in the box, right? I mean, that's all you really need. You can park that out in the middle of nowhere and it'll do a fine job until you need to pull it back in. Other questions or comments?
Most of these net control, not net control, but the aid stations, would they just use their radio or they use their packet?
Typically, it depends on what's going on the course, right? Or how the race is set up. Like for Bike MS, we just use voice. But I know that some of the races, they do use packet. And for example, if Dan was here, he could tell us about it, but there was one that he was participating in last year where they were actually using packet radio to track all the runners as they came through the aid station. So they had an application running that you would connect to via packet radio. And as a runner came in, you would key in their bib number, or their ID number, and say that they were coming in or leaving your aid station. And that way, the people at net control could say, if someone said, well, what about runner 505? Key it into the system, it pops up and says they were last seen entering aid station X at such and such a time. So there are software packages that have been built to manage that kind of specifically for these types of events. And you do it over packet radio. So they're tied into the packet radio system. You connect to it with you have a packet radio system. You make a packet connection to the server and run that application, and you're right there able to access that fully. So
That's the Wasatch 100
is it the Wasatch 100? Thanks, Ragnar.
in September.
Okay, I'm assuming they can figure out how soon they'll get to the next station based on.
That software will actually project their location based on what time, how fast they've been moving from station to station. So if they're overdue, it can present a list of runners who are overdue at a particular station. And that way, you could send somebody out along the course to look for those people if they're missing.
Track the riders, then they have a deal that will automatically report them.
I haven't seen any automatic systems like that. I mean, you could do that, but you'd have to give
Each rider.
each rider now I have seen, like, on certain foot races, the runners will have like an RFID tag that they put on their shoe, and then they have like a reader at each station along the way, and as long as they run through that reader, it'll automatically note that they were there. But I haven't heard of that being tied into amateur radio in any way. I think that would be a cool application to take that data and tie it into a system that would automatically report it over a packet link or something like that.
If you don't have something automatically and there's a big, you got 1,500 riders out there and you got 40 in one big clump, how do you get all the numbers?
That can be a problem. Typically, those types of systems are used on the bigger races or longer races that don't have quite so many people participating. Like the systems that I've seen where they have the RFID tag have typically been used on like a 5K race, and it's so they can track like what your time was from start to finish. So as you start, you run through the thing, and when you finish, you run through the thing, and then it automatically calculates how long you were out, how long you were running. But you could utilize something like that on a longer course. I think it would be, it would be very doable to do something like that. I think that would be pretty cool. It would be interesting to build a setup like that and present it to some of these races and say, hey, we could use this. And then, it makes things much easier to track.
which has me curious because it's been like the Murray one. I heard something that's with this show, the other festival where they have really good. From the band with the runners and beforehand, well, we would go in and say, this.
Yeah, they have a little 5K race before the parade, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, so typically that starts at like 7 o'clock and then they're completely off the course by the time the parade starts at 9, right? So
Which makes me wondering if we kind of, we would be, they're running on the parade route, we would be easy to say, okay, here, what is that, we do that?
I don't know if they use that technology or not.
But didn't Murray have race?
They do have runners before the parade, yeah.
Are they using the same routes?
Yeah.
So-
Well, typically I don't think they use the entire parade route, but they'll go 2.5K out and then turn around and go back. So I don't think they follow I don't think they go all the way to the park. But I don't know, they might, I don't know.
Yeah. I think something as far as City Hall now.
So it seemed like the last parade, there was runners that come in where I was at.
There were runners in the park.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So,
Be interesting to look into that and see who manages that run. And do they coordinate with the parade people or not? I don't know. That would be kind of cool to check out. Other comments, questions?
I have one comment.
Yeah,
Usually, during the SAG events, it's encouraged to ride with somebody or go with somebody to a spot. I've even had new hams get on the back of my motorcycle and go with me so they can practice getting comfortable on the radio. So it's not like you're doing it on your own. They encourage, like Mickey especially, to work with somebody else that's got some experience, so you don't have to feel uncomfortable. So it's worth giving it a try.
yeah. If they have multiple operators for each station, they can do that. I know, like when we did the Five Canyons race a couple of years ago, we had at least 2 operators at each station, and that way, for starters, you didn't have to do everything yourself. You could switch back and forth as who was actually talking on the radio and who was kind of paying attention to the riders and things like that. But the other thing was, like you say, Ragnar, somebody with less experience could have the opportunity to get more experience by hanging out with a more experienced operator. And as you have questions, there's somebody there that you can talk to and ask about it. So always a good idea. I know, like with Bike MS, we typically don't have enough people to do that because it's field day and a lot of people are out doing field day rather than participating in the race. So
It seems like when they talk about these, they say you'll never be by yourself.
ideally you won't be. But again, it depends on the event, right? When I've done Bike MS every year for probably 7 years now, and I've always been by myself at the aid station. I mean, the aid station staff is there, but they're not radio operators, right? So
So it's kind of, you have, people with different functions doing, but.
yeah, there's people there, right? So like at an aid station, you're gonna have people who are stocking up the goodies for the riders as they come through, making sure that garbage is thrown away, bagged up and thrown away effectively and things like that. Plus, things like the station being set up, any tables that need to be set up or awnings or anything like that. As a radio operator, you generally don't have to do any of that type of stuff. But yeah, I've always been the only radio operator at the aid stations that I've been at on the Bike MS at least. It seems like they always have trouble getting enough operators. So, that's at least for that one. For other events, I've seen they don't have any trouble getting enough people, and you can have 2 operators at every station, and it works out well. I have seen like husband and wife teams as SAG drivers before, where one will drive and the other will operate the radio. So that's kind of a good way to go, because that way the driver is not having to concentrate on the radio, but their co-driver is able to handle the communications tasks. And again, they can switch off if they need to, but I've seen people do that before.
So the MS starts at Willow Park up there in Logan.
It starts at at the fairgrounds area there.
Willow Park is right close to
Yeah. Yeah, it's just north of the park, I think.
it.
It starts at the fairgrounds and goes on the Saturday, it goes all the way up into Idaho and back down through like Newton and
Clarkston.
Clarkston, a couple of the little small towns up that way. So and then on Sunday it starts at the park and goes south to whatever that town is there by the road that goes up to Harbor Ranch and then back down. So Nibley, I think it is, yeah. And so they have typically an aid station there. They'll have a water stop at the top of the mountain. They'll have another station on the way back that's kind of out in the neighborhood. But it's a lot of fun.
That goes 2 days, right?
2 days, yeah. You don't have to do both days, right? I mean, some operators can only do one day. So, you know, when you sign up for the event, just let them know what you can do and what you're available for.
So what time of the day that they start each day and what time do they end?
Typically for a race type of event, they'll stagger the start of the operators' responsibilities, because obviously if the race kicks off at 8 o'clock, riders aren't going to be getting to the midpoint aid station for at least an hour. So, you know, operators at the start finish line need to be there by 7:30, but operators at Nibley, for example, don't need to be there until 8 o'clock or 7:45 or whatever, right? So they kind of stagger that out. And typically after all the riders have gone through, that station will close down. Some stations are used both out and in which case they stay open all day, but other stations are only, you know, people come through and once they're all gone, you're out of there by noon, you know. So
Updating the trailer up there.
I know Mickey has done that where he does usually the Lewiston station up there. And he's taken his trailer and just camped at the site. So he's there when it starts and he's, you know, ready to roll out when it's done. So other comments? Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. I'm gonna go ahead and, if I can't stop this recording.
It was actually 8 stations like Lewis.
Yeah, usually the lunch